Thank you so much for joining us here. So my first question is, what made you want to cover politics?
Well, I was covering aviation, and I was writing a lot about plane crashes, and planes stopped crashing. And I realized I better find something different to write about. I had always covered politics some. Going back to like the early 1990s, I was one of the backup reporters covering politics. And then when I got to the Washington Bureau in 1997, politics became a bigger part of my portfolio. What made me want to cover it? So politics is important journalism in many ways. Of course, policies affect our lives, and we need to hold our elected officials accountable. So that was a big appeal to me. But I also liked the characters who are involved in politics. And one of the reasons I've been a journalist all my career is that I love telling stories about interesting characters. And so when I look back at my favorite stories that I did when I was covering Congress, even when I was covering the White House, they were stories about interesting, sometimes weird people doing fascinating things. And that's really the root of great journalism for me. And as much as I became known for PolitiFact, before PolitiFact, I was known as a feature writer, as somebody who took you behind the scenes in politics and described how politics works. And I love doing that.
What would you say is one of the favorite characters that you've covered?
Well, I really liked Senator Bob Graham, who was a U.S. Senator from Florida. He had been governor of Florida and then became a U.S. Senator, and he let me spend a lot of time with him, and I really got to know him in ways that I think the National Press Corps didn't. The National Press Corps thought he was weird, and I didn't think he was weird. I thought he was unusual. The National Press Corps thought he was weird because he used to write every day in little notebooks, like a little journal. But if you looked at those notebooks, and you could make a public records request for them when he was governor, they said things like, 10 a.m., put on new trousers. And so he was a fascinating guy, very smart, really understood policy. So I would put him up there. I also love covering John McCain. I covered John McCain going back to when I was in college at Arizona State University. I wrote my first story about him, and wrote about him when he was a senator and when he was a presidential candidate. And I just found his story to be fascinating, and also he was very accessible to the media, and he would talk to you and be pretty honest about things, and I always really appreciated that. So those would be probably the first two that come to mind in a long career when I've written about a lot of interesting people in a lot of fields.
And as you mentioned earlier, you founded PolitiFact in 2007. What made you want to found PolitiFact?
Guilt. I had been covering Congress and the White House, and I felt like we didn't do enough fact-checking. Fact-checking had started in the sort of in the 1990s, and then kind of petered out by 2000. And it had gotten a little bit of resurgence in 2003 when factcheck.org came along. But I felt like we needed to do more. I also felt we needed to do it in a more lively way. I'm very aware that people's time is limited, and they don't want to read long stories about a fact check. But they do like to see a summary of that thorough reporting in the form of a truthometer. And so I came up with this concept of individual statements that would get rated on the truthometer, and then a structure of the website that would allow us to apply, to tally up the fact checks that had been done on any given politician. And so it was a way of holding politicians accountable. It was a way of calling out their falsehoods. And most importantly, it was a way of answering questions that everybody has. They hear a politician say something and they wonder, really? Is that true? And that's what a fact check answers. And one of our other innovations was, unlike some other fact checking organizations, if we found that a statement was true, if we thought people wondered about it, we would still publish a fact check and award a true rating. And that was different than the way that fact checking had been done until then.
How would you say fact checking has evolved over the years since 2007?
If you were to chart it the way we have in the Duke Reporters Lab, you would see a great increase in fact checking, particularly around the world. It just went up every year. We started counting in 2014, and the number of fact-checking sites has grown and grown and grown until recently. And it has really leveled off. It hasn't actually declined the way we thought it might, but it has leveled off. And we attribute that to lack of funding, that fact checkers just can't draw on the resources they used to be able to. Most of them are supported through charitable contributions, donations from foundations, grants from foundations, that sort of thing. And that money isn't the level that it used to be. And so I think that has slowed the growth. And it makes me concerned about the future of fact-checking, because I think a lot of foundations were into fact-checking for a while and have gotten out of it. And I hope they realize how important it is to our discourse.
How has PolitiFact been impacted by the lack of funding?
So PolitiFact has stayed strong. They still have a substantial staff. I don't know the exact number, but I think it's probably 10 to 12 full-time employees. They're not as big as they once were. When I was editor of PolitiFact, we had, depending how you counted them, a dozen state franchises. So we went into different states, including North Carolina, and did PolitiFact North Carolina, or PolitiFact Oregon, or PolitiFact New Jersey. And we did those as partnerships with local media organizations that paid a licensing fee and paid to have their own PolitiFact staff. And it was a great way to expand fact-checking around the country. That has declined because media organizations don't have the resources to do that as much anymore. And so PolitiFact's state partnerships have declined. In general, though, I'm really glad to see PolitiFact doing well. It's run out of the Poynter Institute, and Poynter has raised grants from a lot of different organizations to keep the important work going. And PolitiFact is still, I think, the standard for fact-checking around, at least in the United States, and it's a leader around the world in the way that it does important fact checks promptly so that you can answer that question. Is that true?
Neutrality when fact checking. How do you stay neutral when you are doing fact checking, and what do you think the importance of neutrality is?
As with most political reporters, PolitiFact reporters cannot be involved in politics as an activist. So they can't take part in rallies, they can't endorse candidates, they can't put signs in their yard for different political candidates, and that's important. They can still vote, and I think most political fact checkers do vote, and they're entitled to, but they can't voice those opinions. They can't, advocate for a candidate. So I think that's one important thing. For the fact check itself, and I'm glad you used the word neutrality, for a fact check itself, that means talking to initially the person who made the claim. So if a senator makes a claim and PolitiFact's going to fact check it, the first thing the reporter does is contact the senator's office and say, hey, the senator made this claim. What is the basis for that claim? What is the source? And then sometimes the organization, the senator's organization will respond. Other times they won't. Doesn't matter. The PolitiFact reporter will then look for all perspectives on that issue. And that would be, if it's a partisan issue, how would each party interpret and explain the factual claim? And then, most importantly, seeking independent experts. So someone who's nonpartisan, or at least not affiliated with one side or the other, and try to get an independent voice. Then write a fact check, and if you look at PolitiFact's style, it's very consistent. It manages to be conversational, but not to be partisan. And although sometimes the PolitiFact voice might express kind of outrage at a ridiculous claim, it's not a partisan voice. And so I think that's something that PolitiFact has done well now for nearly 20 years since I started it.
So for your recent book, Beyond the Big Lie, what research did you do for that?
So I interviewed many elected officials and just talked to them about lying. Hey, tell me about lies, how they've affected your political life. Have you ever lied? Very few would admit to it. I talked to a lot of political aides. Some political aides and campaign operatives were willing to acknowledge that they had lied. And then we did a data analysis of PolitiFact fact checks to analyze something that I had been reluctant to ever talk about, which was which party lies more. And so we did that. We also analyzed Washington Post fact checks to see if the patterns were consistent. And then I just read a ton to see what sort of things people had said about fact checking. And so all of that, I think, resulted in a book that covers many different aspects of political lying.
What does fact-checking mean for our society?
Fact-checking is vital for our society. It is still so important, even in an age when we say we don't know what to believe. Oh, they're lying all the time. The fact checkers can't keep up with all the lies. It's critical that at this moment we tell people what the facts are so that they can make smart decisions in our democracy. It's also important so that we can assess policy. When one party says something about immigration, the fact checkers need to check that out and see if it's true, or both parties say things about immigration. But in terms of explaining the Trump administration's activities on immigration, they've made a series of claims about immigrants that come into the United States who are undocumented. And it's really important to check those things out and tell people what's true and what's not.